everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading Chapter 7 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Remember, if you like what you hear in this episode, hit that like and subscribe button, and let's dig in. Georgia now put Cherokee land on sale and moved militia in to crush any sign of Cherokee resistance. The Cherokees followed a policy of non-violence, though their property was being taken, their homes were being burned, their schools were closed, their women mistreated, and liquor was being sold in their churches to render them even more helpless. That same year, Jackson was declaring states' rights for Georgia on the Cherokee question in 1832. He was attacking South Carolina's right to nullify a federal tariff. His easy re-election in 1832, 687,000 to 530,000 for his opponent Henry Clay, suggested that his anti-Indian policies were in keeping with popular sentiment, at least among those white males who could vote, perhaps 2 million of the total population of 13 million. Jackson now moved to speed up Indian removal. Most of the Choctaws and some of the Cherokees were gone, but there were still 22,000 Creeks in Alabama, 18,000 Cherokees in Georgia, and 5,000 Seminoles in Florida. The Creeks had been fighting for their land ever since the years of Columbus against Spaniards, English, French, and Americans, but by 1832 they had been reduced to a small area in Alabama, while the population of Alabama, growing fast, was now over 300,000. On the basis of extravagant promises from the federal government, Creek delegates in Washington signed the Treaty of Washington, agreeing to removal behind the Mississippi. They gave up 5 million acres, with the provision that 2 million of these would go to individual Creeks who could either sell or remain in Alabama with federal protection. Van Every writes of this treaty, "The interminable history of diplomatic relations between Indians and white men had before 1832 recorded no single instance of a treaty which had not been presently broken by the white parties to it, however solemnly embellished with such terms as permanent, forever, for all time, so long as the sun shall rise, but no agreement between white men and Indians had ever been so soon abrogated as the 1832 Treaty of Washington. Within days, the promises made in it on behalf of the United States had been broken." Days. A white invasion of Creek lands began. Looters, land seekers, defrauders, whiskey sellers, thugs, driving thousands of Creeks from their homes into the swamps and forests. The federal government did nothing. Instead, it negotiated a new treaty, providing for prompt emigration west, managed by the Creeks themselves, financed by the national government. An army colonel, dubious that this would work, wrote, "They fear starvation on the route, and can it be otherwise when many of them are nearly starving now without the embarrassment of a long journey on their hands? You cannot have an idea on the deterioration which these Indians have undergone during the last 2 or 3 years, from a general state of comparative plenty to that of unqualified wretchedness and want. The free egress into the nation by the whites, encroachment upon their lands, even upon their cultivated fields, abuses of their person, hosts of traders who, like locusts, have devoured their substance and inundated their homes with whiskey, have destroyed what little disposition to cultivation the Indians may once have had. They are browbeat and cowed and imposed upon and depressed with the feeling that they have no adequate protection in the United States and no capacity of self-protection in themselves. Northern political sympathizers with the Indian seem to be fading away, preoccupied with other issues. So Americans were easily distracted even then. Daniel Webster was making a rousing speech in the Senate for the authority of law, the power of the general government, but he was not referring to Alabama, Georgia, and the Indians. He was talking about South Carolina's nullification of the tariff. Despite the hardships, the Creeks refused to budge. But by 1836, both state and federal officials decided they must go. Using as a pretext some attacks by desperate Creeks on white soldiers, it was declared that the Creek Nation, by making war, had forfeited its treaty rights that they would have stolen anyway. The army would now force it to migrate west. Fewer than 100 Creeks had been involved in the war, but 1,000 had fled into the woods, afraid of white reprisals. An army of 11,000 was sent after them. The Creeks did not resist. No shots were fired. They surrendered. Those Creeks, presumed by the army to be rebels or sympathizers, were assembled, the men manacled and chained together to march westward under military guard, their women and children trailing after them. Creek communities were invaded by military detachments, the inhabitants driven to assembly points and marched westward in batches of 2,000 or 3,000. No talk of compensating them for land or property left behind. When you were learning about the Indians being forced off their lands, is this how you learned it? Having them all manacled together and forcibly marched with their families trailing behind them? Private contracts were made for the march. Of course they were. The same kind that had failed for the Choctaws. Again, delays and lack of food, shelter, clothing, blankets, medical attention. Again, old rotting steamboats and ferries crowded beyond capacity, taking them across the Mississippi. By midwinter, the interminable stumbling procession of more than 15,000 Creeks stretched from border to border across Arkansas. Starvation and sickness began to cause large numbers of deaths. The passage of the exiles could be distinguished from afar by the howling of trailing wolf packs and the circling flocks of buzzards, Van Every writes. 800 Creek men had volunteered to help the United States Army fight the Seminoles in Florida in return for a promise that their families could remain in Alabama, protected by the federal government until the men returned. You think that promise was kept? The promise was not kept. The Creek families were attacked by land-hungry white marauders, robbed, driven from their homes, women raped. Then the army, claiming it was for their safety, removed them from Creek country to a concentration camp on Mobile Bay. Hundreds died there from lack of food and from sickness. When the warriors returned from the Seminole War, they and their families were hustled west. Moving through New Orleans, they encountered a yellow fever plague. They crossed the Mississippi. 611 Indians crowded onto the aged steamer Monmouth. It went down in the Mississippi River, and 311 people died. 4 of them, the children of the Indian commander of the Creek Volunteers in Florida. A New Orleans newspaper wrote, "The fearful responsibility for this vast sacrifice of human life rests on the contractors. The avaricious disposition to increase the profits on the speculation first induced the chartering of rotten, old, and unseaworthy boats, because they were of a class to be procured cheaply, and then to make those increased profits still larger, the Indians were packed upon those crazy vessels in such crowds that not the slightest regard seems to have been paid for their safety, comfort, or even decency." The Choctaws and Chickasaws had quickly agreed to migrate. The Creeks were stubborn and had to be forced. The Cherokees were practicing a non-violent resistance. One tribe, the Seminoles, decided to fight. With Florida now belonging to the United States, Seminole territory was open to American land grabbers. They moved down into North Florida from St. Augustine to Pensacola and down the Fertile Coast Strip. In 1823, the Treaty of Camp Moultrie was signed by a few Seminoles who got large personal land holdings in North Florida, and agreed that all the Seminoles would leave northern Florida and every coastal area and move into the interior. This meant withdrawing into the swamps of central Florida, where they could not grow food, where even wild game could not survive. The pressure to move west out of Florida mounted, and in 1834, Seminole leaders were assembled, and the U.S. Indian agent told them they must move west. Here were some of the replies of the Seminoles at that meeting. "We were all made by the same great Father, and are all alike his children. We all came from the same mother, and were suckled at the same breast. Therefore we are brothers, and as brothers should treat together in an amicable way." That's a second response. "Your talk is a good one, but my people cannot say they will go. We are not willing to do so. If their tongues say yes, their hearts cry no, and call them liars." And then a third response. "If suddenly we tear our hearts from the homes around which they are twined, our heartstrings will snap." The Indian agent managed to get 15 chiefs and sub-chiefs to sign a removal treaty. The U.S. Senate promptly ratified it, and the War Department began making preparations for the migration. Violence between whites and Seminoles now erupted. A young Seminole chief, Osceola, who had been imprisoned and chained by the Indian agent Thompson, and whose wife had been delivered into slavery, became a leader of the growing resistance. When Thompson ordered the Seminoles in December 1835 to assemble for the journey, no one came. Instead, the Seminoles began a series of guerrilla attacks on white coastal settlements all along the Florida perimeter, striking in surprise and in succession from the interior. They murdered white families, captured slaves, destroyed property. Osceola himself, in a lightning stroke, shot down Thompson and an army lieutenant. That same day, December 28, 1835, a column of 110 soldiers was attacked by Seminoles, and all but 3 soldiers were killed. One of the survivors later told the story. "It was 8 o'clock. Suddenly I heard a rifle shot, followed by a musket shot. I had not time to think of the meaning of these shots before a volley, as if from 1,000 rifles, was poured in upon us from the front and all along our left flank. I could only see their heads and arms peering out from the long grass, far and near, and from behind the pine trees. It was the classic Indian tactic against a foe with superior arms. General George Washington had once given parting advice to one of his officers, General St. Clair, in 3 words, beware of surprise. Again and again, General, beware of surprise. Congress now appropriated money for a war against the Seminoles. In the state, Henry Clay of Kentucky opposed the war. He was an enemy of Jackson, a critic of Indian removal. But his Whig colleague, Daniel Webster, displayed that unity across party lines which became standard in American wars. The view taken by the gentleman from Kentucky was undoubtedly the true one. But the war rages, the enemy is in force, and the accounts of their ravages are disastrous. The executive government has asked for the means of suppressing these hostilities, and it was entirely proper that the bill should pass. General Winfield Scott took charge, but his columns of troops, marching impressively into Seminole territory, found no one. They became tired of the mud, the swamps, the heat, the sickness, the hunger, the classic fatigue of a civilized army fighting people on their own land. No one wanted to face Seminoles in the Florida swamps. In 1836, 103 commissioned officers resigned from the regular army, leaving only 46. In the spring of 1837, Major General Jessup moved into the war with an army of 10,000, but the Seminoles just faded into the swamps, coming out from time to time to strike at isolated forces. The war went on for years. The army enlisted other Indians to fight the Seminoles, but that didn't work either. Van Every says the adaptation of the Seminole to his environment was to be matched only by the crane or the alligator. It was an 8-year war. It cost $20 million and 1,500 American lives. Finally, in the 1840s, the Seminoles began to get tired. They were a tiny group against a huge nation with great resources. They asked for truces. But when they went forward under truce flags, they were arrested again and again. In 1837, Osceola, under a flag of truce, had been seized and put in irons, then died of illness in prison. The war petered out. Meanwhile, the Cherokees had not fought back with arms, but had resisted in their own way. And so the government began to play Cherokee against Cherokee, the old game. The pressures built up on the Cherokee community, their newspaper suppressed, their government dissolved, their missionaries in jail, their land parceled among whites by the land lottery. In 1834, 700 Cherokees, weary of the struggle, agreed to go west. 81 died en route, including 45 children, mostly from measles and cholera. Those who lived arrived at their destination across the Mississippi in the midst of a cholera epidemic, and half of them died within a year. The Cherokees were summoned to sign the removal treaty in New Echota, Georgia, in 1836, but fewer than 500 of the 17,000 Cherokees appeared. The treaty was signed anyway. The Senate, including Northerners who had once spoken for the Indian, ratified it, yielding, as Senator Edward Everett of Massachusetts said, to the force of circumstances, the hard necessity. Now the Georgia whites stepped up their attacks to speed the removal. The government did not move immediately against the Cherokees. In April 1838, Ralph Waldo Emerson, addressed an open letter to President Van Buren, referring with indignation to the removal treaty with the Cherokees, signed behind the backs of an overwhelming majority of them, and asked what had happened to the sense of justice in America. The soul of man, this is Emerson, the soul of man, the justice, the mercy that is the heart's heart in all men, from Maine to Georgia, does abhor this business. A crime is projected that confounds our understandings by its magnitude, a crime that really deprives us, as well as the Cherokees, of a country. For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country any more? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy, and if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy. That's a weird word. And the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world. 13 days before Emerson sent this letter, Martin Van Buren had ordered Major General Winfield Scott into Cherokee territory to use whatever military force was required to move the Cherokees west. 5 regiments of regulars and 4,000 militia and volunteers began pouring into Cherokee country. General Scott addressed the Indians. Cherokees, the President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army to cause you, in obedience to the Treaty of 1834, to join that part of your people who are already established in prosperity on the other side of the Mississippi. The full moon of May is already on the wane, and before another shall have passed, every Cherokee man, woman, and child must be in motion to join their brethren in the far west. My troops already occupy many positions in the country that you are about to abandon, and thousands are approaching from every quarter to tender resistance and escape alike hopeless. Chiefs, headmen, and warriors, will you then by resistance compel us to resort to arms? God forbid. Or will you by flight seek to hide yourselves in mountains and forests, and thus oblige us to hunt you down? Some Cherokees had already apparently given up on nonviolence. 3 chiefs who signed the removal treaty were found dead, but the 17,000 Cherokees were soon rounded up and crowded into stockades. On October 1st, 1838, the first detachment set out in what was to be known as the Trail of Tears. As they moved westward, they began to die of sickness, of drought, of the heat, of exposure. There were 645 wagons and people marching alongside. Survivors years later told of halting at the edge of the Mississippi in the middle of winter, the river running full of ice. Hundreds of sick and dying, penned up in wagons or stretched upon the ground. Grant Foreman, the leading authority on Indian removal, estimates that during confinement in the stockade or on the march westward, 4,000 Cherokees died. In December 1838, President Van Buren spoke to Congress. It affords sincere pleasure to apprise the Congress of the entire removal of the Cherokee Nation of Indians to their new homes west of the Mississippi. The measures authorized by Congress at its last session have had the happiest effects. This is hard reading. I appreciate you joining me, and I appreciate your sticking with me. I hope to keep tuning in for the next episode and for episodes after. And if you like what you're hearing, hit that like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. See you next time.